get started, and I've offered Elder Carl Stone some tobacco to provide us with the traditional opening.
I've been offered tobacco. We were kind of joking about it when Lynn was talking to me, and she says, "I know this is short notice, but I'm offering this tobacco to you." And I says, "I'll give you my answer in 4 days." But, the elders, when they teach us, they get us to try and do it at the very least 4 days ahead of time. But I'm just giving a teaching.
He's not reprimanding you.
And so I told her, yeah, we understand. I understand that teaching. It said, well, 4 days, 4 minutes, and there's still a 4 in there. Then she says, yeah, 4 seconds. Kind of thing. But I just wanted to. I'm saying that in a way of acknowledging the tobacco and the traditions of that we have in passing the tobacco, because our elders teach us that this is one of the medicines that was given to us first, and that it leads. And when we ask of someone to do something, the tobacco is passed. In the same way that we do when we go pick medicines, we put the tobacco down and we ask the medicines to work with us. And I just want to acknowledge the students that are here and the people that are studying medicine in many forms. And words are a very powerful medicine. I work with a men's group that every Thursday is actually starting tonight at Migizigatmik. And one of the things that we say in there that words is medicine, and they can be very, very, very powerful and strong. And I know Barry's words and message when he speaks to me is very strong. I really like listening to what he has to say because it's very thought-provoking. It makes me think anyway about things I may not have thought about before, and it causes me to ask questions in a good way, you know. And earlier this morning, I was talking with a young student that's her first year here, and I shared that it's important that you have a wonderful experience here, and invited them to come here and listen to the talk today. Because a talk like this today, and many that you're going to be listening to and speaking to the students and my colleagues and staff, it becomes our experience here at this university and makes the experience a good experience here, hopefully. That's what we intend to do. And those experiences end up becoming a part of our life story, because we're impacted or we're influenced in such a way that we adjust our life and living to walk in a different way, take another kind way of walking. And so that's what I want to say in honoring of this tobacco and the request that was made. So as much as I can, I'm going to use my language and then just give thanks for today. Okay? I give thanks to the Creator for this day and the good life that He's given. I give thanks to our grandmothers and our grandfathers for the good life that they gave. And I give thanks to all our relatives that give us the life that we live today. And I say,
Carl. I want to welcome you all. I'm Dr. Lynn LaValle, Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement, and this is the first in the Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series. And we started this out of the Office of Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement to honor our own as Indigenous academics. Sometimes we're asked to guest lecture across the world, as Dr. Barry Lavallée is often asked, and we sometimes fail to acknowledge who we have here. So that's the intent of this speaker series, and we're going to have a speaker every 2 weeks. It'll be in this room, I think, for the most part. All of the scheduled activities, Ruth, are in this room, right?
Yeah,
for
this term, yeah.
So you can check Indigenous Connect, and obviously you're here, you got the message, so we're going to be blasting folks' emails and to ensure that we get a broad representation. This is open to everybody at the U of M, the entire community, as well as outside. I want to also acknowledge folks who may have joined us on Facebook Live. We have some people on Facebook Live, there you go. And we're doing that because we often hear when we hold events, people can't make it. Our schedules are so busy. So we're Facebook Living this, and we are going to, with the permission of the speakers, ensure that we can post that and people can view it at a later date. But obviously we're going to get approval from our speakers. We're going to take a question and answer at the end, and we'll also take question and answers through Facebook Live. So for those of you listening, you can type in your question, and then Ruth will hand the question over. I guess I'm just going to introduce Dr. Barry Lavallée. Barry is a member of the First Nation and Métis communities in Manitoba. His ancestral territories are located in St. Laurent, Duck Bay, and Lake Manitoba First Nation. He is a member of the Bear Clan. He practices family medicine in Winnipeg. He is currently senior physician with Algonquin Education and leads the Indigenous Health longitudinal course in undergraduate medicine at the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences, University of Manitoba. I want to say something about that. Dr. Lavallée is known as a leader globally with respect to indigenizing curriculum in schools of medicine. He serves as a medical advisor to the Diabetes Integration Project at the First Nations Health Services and Social Secretariat of Manitoba, Nana Dawe Wigabing. The continuing impact of racism, oppression, and colonization on the health and healing of Indigenous communities and the relationship to chronic disease centers in his work with diabetes and chronic kidney disease, fostering an anti-racist and anti-colonial framework through a non-deficits model of engagement in the patient-provider relationship permits the humanization of Indigenous peoples. His research focuses on chronic disease among First Nations communities. He was co-investigator for a project that intends to reduce the burden of dialysis among First Nations, employing a population-based intervention of screening, location of disease, and appropriate matching to clinical services. He and his colleagues were successful in writing a grant from the Canadian Institute of Health Research to provide definitive evidence that point-of-care testing is superior to health education in reducing the burden of chronic kidney disease among First Nations and other Indigenous communities in Canada. Welcome, Dr. Barry Lavallée.
I want to thank Carl for that opening. I thought I loved listening to Carl. For the young people who are here, the Access students and the other students who have come today, when you see some of the people like Carl, you have to remember him as long as he's here. He's a support to you in many ways, as well as we have Mary Wilson and Margaret LaValle who are sitting at the front here as well. They are elders for us at the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences, and they engage with our students, with our faculty, and actually in research as well. So that's the kind of the continuous tension to include our ways of knowing and our ways of being into this very colonial system. I made this particular slide mostly for white people, but now that I see that there's mostly my people in here, which is always telling for these lectures, okay? Because, you know, like in one instance, because I'm an orator, so I can speak to things really, really well. And that's probably a traditional thing for my people, or maybe my clan system. And so my intention is to inspire Indigenous people at this academy to continue to resist white colonization of your mind, your body, and your soul. This is what it's about. And so we have to actually stick together. We have to see each other, hear each other, and engage with each other. And I'm really, really very happy we have a lot of young learners over here. So partly I'm going to adjust everything for you. But in order to acknowledge the intersectionality of how oppression works at this male-dominated institution, when the Q&A comes, my response will be to only females who ask questions. So if you are a white male in the room, I probably won't ask for your engagement, not because I am trying to create a problem, but white male dominance at this institution is what this institution and other institutions is about. So for like 15 minutes of your life, I won't answer you, but nothing will happen to your health outcomes, I guarantee. However, what it will demonstrate for people in the crowd, especially our women in the crowd who are Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, you are number one. When you ask a question, put your hand up. And I'll finish you, okay? And that's not to create division or anything of that nature, but it's for us to understand our own social positioning at this institution. Because our positioning at this institution, say for example for me, I have to be careful about what I say because it can project gender violence into a woman's body, okay? So, and that violence comes from within me. It has nothing to do with the female. But this is how our society is made. So I have to always be careful about the things I say and to be open when my co-leads and my co-researchers who are female make mention of something that I've said. I have to reflect very deeply because it is an ongoing process to eliminate racism, to eliminate gender violence, to eliminate homophobia, to eliminate ableism. Because all of those things actually, when you explore health outcomes for Indigenous peoples, it is the dark-skinned Indigenous woman who is a lesbian and who is in a wheelchair who will suffer the greatest impacts of this white male-dominated society. And in fact, when we look at the data and when we examine health outcomes for our own people, we see that and we see you. Except we've never, at this institute, I've been here since 82, I think, when I went into, I think it was 82, I can't remember. Let's see, 88, 4 years. Yeah, so in the 80s I was here. We weren't actually allowed to actually speak the words because we could see that they were distinguishing things between Indigenous population and non-Indigenous population, but we weren't allowed to articulate because we didn't have any of the words like white supremacy, racism, whiteness, oppression. How does that look? How does that thing that you express as actual violence, even if it comes from a white person with a smiling face, it still is as violent in many cases as the 3 white men who string up a black man in 1915 Alabama. The violence has intention, and we'll talk a little bit about that intentionality. Now, I want to just say thank you to Lynn and to the organizers for inviting me here, and thank you so much for making me feel welcome. Thank you so much for making it really feels, it touches me a great deal. And I have like a lot of friends here, a corral of people who follow me around. So, Barry Lavalley, Indigenous Casse, Tremendonji, je m'appelle Barry Lavalley, mes parents sont venus de Saint-Laurent, un petit village métis, à peu près 50 km nord du Winnipeg. And the community of my origin, like for my parents, but their grandparents came from reserves and things like that, when Canada was being dismantled, it continues to be dismantled for us. And so the first language of my parents was Ojibwe. They're both dead now. And then the second language was Métis, and then third would be colonial language, French, and then fourth would be English. and my grandparents were Cree speakers because I think we're related to the Southern Cree ancestrally, for sure. So, you know, when I grew up, most of the languages I heard were not English, but I grew up in an English environment. So I try and express that in honor of Margaret, who's trying to teach me something about my Indigenous self all the time. So I say it for her. So some of the words, like I particularly, Linda Diffie now. Linda's back there. Raise your hand, Linda. Okay. That's Linda Diffie. Linda Diffie is a co-scholar and co-lead for the longitudinal Indigenous health course at the Faculty of Health Sciences School of Medicine that she and I have been working for about 15-ish years now across Canada to try and develop a curriculum that could be inputted into about 17 medical schools across this country. In the last several years, we focused only on Manitoba to try and create a pedagogy or andragogy that is based in not what the Indigenous body is or is not, but rather the composition and the positionality of white people. And by saying white people, I'm outing white people as a race, but I'm also saying that people of color who are settlers to these lands also have a special position that's different than Indigenous peoples on these settler lands. And we can explore that a little bit. This is very important because my talk is going to be really specifically about Indigenous specific racism and its consequences to the body of Indigenous peoples today. We can talk about historical pasts, like the residential school, or the ongoing imprisonment of Indigenous children in child and family services for nothing other than poverty, which is socially constructed to be so for Indigenous peoples. And so what we have to do is we have to disassemble some of the stereotypes about us, which are the key currency for settler Canada, to be able to call itself diverse, multicultural, all-saving, all-encompassing, because it's not true for us. We don't come from a multicultural society that's called Canada. We are removed from that benefit of being a settler, because we are not settlers to these lands. We actually are original to these lands. These lands, and this is kind of a political statement, these lands that we sit on are still stolen. And that's despite the treaties. And that's no offense against our ancestors who signed those treaties. But the condition of the state of Canada in the context of Indigenous peoples proves that these lands remain stolen. And that positionality for us as Indigenous peoples is very sacred, is very different, and we don't run. You see, we don't run to London or Berlin or Nigeria or anywhere and create little colonies of Ojibwe speaking people or Cree speaking people or Michif speaking. We actually stay in our lands and we fight. So because we rarely move, because that's just not our nature to do that, to become settlers in that regard. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about this Human Rights Commission. And what you see on the slide here is this definition of racism. Sometimes people get a little bit, what time do I have to end?
Whenever.
Oh, okay. So I'll keep it time, I gotta be timed here. So racism. So racism is really an organization, and they call it an ideology. So it's an organization of people based on superficial appearances, right? So if you're really dark skin colored or really light skin colored, if you have blue eyes, brown eyes, blonde hair, black hair, all of these kinds of things. You know, people are always trying to do superficial appearances and attribute superficial appearances to deeper things. And this is the problem with stereotyping of Indigenous peoples in settler society. So racism that's Indigenous specific is necessary to speak about. Racism indeed affects other people of color, etc. But racism that's Indigenous specific is the currency of what settler Canada is made out of today. And it has to be, because the ongoing rape and appropriation, violently and otherwise, of our lands is linked to our body. So if you look at mortality and morbidity rates of Indigenous peoples compared to other peoples, our rates are higher. And Shireen Razak, she's now in UCLA, speaks about this in a number of articles that she addresses Indigenous men's death in custody. that Indigenous peoples are the continuous product of settler society's fantasy that we remain and continue to be the dead and dying Indian. Because historically, for those who aren't historians, for Canada, when the waves of viral diseases came over from 1492 and onwards, and multiples of waves, they traveled actually through the paths that Indigenous peoples had created to connect all across Turtle Island and the South Islands as well. And there are paths where we traded, we exchanged knowledges, all this kind of stuff. So people, Indigenous people were dying of smallpox, which was an unknown disease, 2 generations before they actually saw a white man. And you have to think about that. Wow. So it'd be like a generation of people with all your knowledges and all your practices, that this thing, these spotches come up and people die violently. And up to 50%, so 1 in 2 people would die. And can you imagine the chaos that would cause in our multiple communities across this island? So one author, his name is Stannard, he's out of the University of Hawaii, he suggests that up to 100 million Indigenous peoples died by 1592, about 100 years. And they died by 3 mechanisms. One was disease, that in some later years was weaponized, like in smallpox and the blanket, was weaponized to kill more Indian people. And then violence, like murder, and starvation. And up until 1880 and even onwards, one could say today that Indians still die of those 3 things, albeit in altered forms, where the state actually conceals that starvation isn't impacting First Nations kids today. But it is. Starvation and not eating well impacts people's health today. And it could propagate death, it could propagate sickness and illness. And that the hunger that Indigenous kids specifically feel in Canada today is created by the state that is called Canada. And its intention is about the land. Because it's necessary, actually, to live on stolen land and to pretend you could sleep well on stolen land as long as the original people are gone or they're made subhuman. This is really important to understand. And why is it important in a context of an academy such as this? Because the struggle to be a scholar or an Indigenous person at any academy, including this academy, the University of Manitoba, is that we have to contend with the continuous lies about who we are and what's going on with us. And in that context, we have to get good marks in the BA, good marks in the BSc, be successful in medicine, be successful in our PhDs and things like that. I'm going to tell you, it is exhausting. It is exhausting. And that's not a negative thing, especially for the young people who are here, because you are our hope for the future when you come here. Okay, you're our hope for our community. But there's a lot of energy that you will expend on maintaining the authenticity of who you are as an Indigenous person, at the same time having to ensure that you get a C or a B average to get on to the next phase of your academic career. It is exhausting, and I want to share that with the non-Indigenous people here. For those of you who are women, you know what that exhaustion is about, is to maintain your authenticity as a woman, I'd imagine, in the context of doing all the things you can. If you're of color in this class, and you're not Indigenous, you know what racism feels like. If you're disabled, if you're openly gay, you know what oppression feels like. It takes a lot of energy. It's like sitting in the ocean up to here and just standing there for an hour. And the force that's underneath there trying to take you off your feet is much the same as how racism feels anywhere and at this institution. So there is a logic around Indigenous specific racism, because the colonial system is invested in us. We are an investment. We produce monies, we produce lands, we produce opportunities. We have whole systems that are dependent upon our illness. Take the health sciences, for example, health fields. I know there are a number of young people here who are looking at health fields to go into. We have to go into these systems with wide eyes, knowing exactly what happens. So at the Health Science Center, at sometimes, like in rheumatology, for example, where you have arthritis and different kinds of things. It was estimated that 8 out of 10 people were Indigenous who occupied that hospital in that one area. Some places, 20, 30, 40% of the people that you will see who are patients in the healthcare system are Indigenous. If you go to Thompson, it's 80, maybe 90% of the people who occupy health systems are Indigenous. This is important because when I introduce Indigenous health to the medical students every year, I generally will try and convey to them that they have an obligation to understand who Indigenous peoples are, to understand their own positionality in the context of how racism works to diminish Indigenous peoples, because to become a doctor at the University of Manitoba, you will practice on the body of an Indigenous person. Full stop. If you're going to be a nurse here, you will practice on the body of an Indigenous person. Full stop. And we could go on and on and on. So that there is a colonial investment in our suffering in many ways, in our position in poverty, which actually predictably leads to incarceration for some of us, to engagements with police and all these kinds of things, as well as imprisonment in child and family services. So people have jobs because of Indigenous suffering that's created by colonial society. But what does colonial society say about that? It says that Indians are drunks, Indians are lazy, Indians are not intelligent, Indian mothers don't care for their babies, and on and on and on, just a continuous plethora of different kinds of stereotypes. And the work that we do at the Sandys Cultural Safety Training Program with the BC government actually, we examine stereotyping, and that's coming to ending with a doctoral thesis this year. We examined stereotyping. So this was stereotyping that was observed by non-Indigenous people. Okay, it wasn't Indigenous people saying what people call me. This is non-Indigenous people. It's up to 25,000 people who participated in that one particular area. And it appears that Indigenous people in settler society, when they want to go gain access to health services, they enter it only in stereotype. And you have to think about that. What the hell does he mean? It means that when we looked at the data around stereotyping and we extracted data and pulled it off, another one rapidly appeared. And you could pull stereotypes off of the Indigenous body in any context: law, justice, education, on and on, medicine, on and on and on. And the Indigenous person does not have an identity in this multicultural world of Canada. We don't. We are only stereotypes, which is the imaginative thinking of settler society. And that is necessary, completely necessary, that stereotyping occur, because stereotyping is proxy to Indigenous-specific racism. It is how it looks, it is how it acts. And when it's normalized, then racism directed at Indigenous peoples then is normalized, and we don't interrogate it. Why is that important to understand that in the context of what we're trying to do and where we're sitting today? It's because we have to try and dismantle and unravel this white patriarchy that is the University of Manitoba. This is white patriarchy. It's not that I'm against white men or against men, but you have to look at how the system is actually held up. And if we can't uncover our experiences without it being violated through a white person interrogating our experiences as Indigenous peoples, that itself is ongoing violence. And Indigenous peoples, for most times at this institution, have not had an opportunity to speak about what it means to be Indigenous and the multiple times through one day that I have to endure racism while trying to study and get an A+ to get into medicine or to get to nursing. And we have to contend with that. And we have to believe our students and believe our faculty. I know it's difficult because we don't even believe women at this university, their experiences of oppression. We shy away from it. You know, we hide from it. They're all linked in a real way. So I want you to know, for my students, I'm lecturing my students, for the pre-med and pre-professional students, when we talk about Indigenous health and we talk about law and education, our bodies are not the issue. Okay, our bodies are not the issue. Our identities, whether we can wear things that represent who we are as Indigenous people in a society or not, is not the issue. The issue is the structure of everybody else and how they actually sit in a structure that provides white power and privilege in order for them to be successful in every moment, in reality. Okay? This is important for you to understand. So most of us who are Indigenous are affected by intergenerational violence in many ways. So, for example, let me tell you, this is for the students. When you apply to medicine, here's the bar you have to reach, eh? That's academic, you know, blah, 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 okay? And so you're gonna have a whole path, 3 or 4 years there. When you apply to medicine, the settler most likely will be here, not very far. You're gonna be here, but you're just as smart. And when you volley over into medicine, there, boom. And each time that you volley over an exam, your licensing, you're volleying over. Because in settler society, oppression for Indigenous people is continuous. It's not a finale. Just because you become a doctor or a PhD or you get a BA or a BSc, there's no magical solution here. You still will experience that. And so those are the kinds of things that we have to contend with in terms of workforce development. It's really important. Like, people think sometimes that racism is just this haphazard social occurrence and ideology that's hidden, that doesn't actually cross the border as you come into an institution like the University of Manitoba. It's not true. Because to believe so means that we believe that we're very different than other people in Canada. We're not any different. We bring in the same violence that's been embedded within us as we grew up. We bring that to fore here in sophisticated ways at times. So that's when you get the smiling racist, but the conveyance is still the same kind of thing, okay? So you have to ask, who benefits from Indigenous specific racism? And why is there such a great Canadian investment in Indigenous specific racism? Why? Who benefits? The pipelines? I said at Toronto a few years ago at an Indigenous Health Conference, I said 30 refugees have been brought into Canada at a cost of, I think one estimate was about $3.4, $3.2 billion of new and not so new monies and resources. So when you bring in refugees to an area, you have to mobilize a couple more seats in school, a couple more visits to the doctor, you know, all of these kinds of things, right? You mobilize that. Plus you can reassign, if you're a government, new monies directed at that. And at the conference, I said that I am Barry LaValle, I'm a member of an internal refugee group of Canada. And people just freaked out about that, eh? Because they can't think about it. Because they can't think about Indigenous peoples as refugees on their own lands. Because it stinks of a really politicized voice where Lou Riel was killed for the same kinds of words, right, in settler society. So when you say these kinds of words in settler society, they carry with them real consequences. And in the old days, you could be jailed for that, or you could be killed for that kind of statement. But we are internal refugees. It doesn't mean that our identity, that we're refugees, we're not. But when you compare people who are refugees who come to Canada, because Canada, again, remembers the all-encompassing, all good country, except for Indians, and they provide physician, education, housing, job opportunity, safety. But if you go to any reserve in Canada or Métis community, and I ask in a survey those 5 things, do you have them predictably? Do you think most of them would say yes? It's rhetorical. No, they wouldn't. So when you compare what Canada does for people who are considered refugees, and we mobilize lots of money, but we can't mobilize money to provide the Island Lake communities with fresh running water of great volume so people can clean their kids, they can have a bowel movement, they can pee and they can flush it anytime they want, they can wash their hands. No, the federal government says, no, we don't have, I think it was at the time $60 million, whatever it was, about 15 years ago. But we do have money for a pipeline, right? And we do have money for other refugees. But the reality is that Indigenous peoples, when you actually look at the definition, we are refugees on our own land. And the consequences of being a refugee on our own land is that in science, in health sciences, we can examine data as long as we can identify you, because it's taken us a long time to identify you, because the powers that be at this university actually didn't want us to identify Indigenous peoples, because they figured that you'd be too shy to identify as Indian. But nobody ever asked me again. Of course I want to be identified at every moment. So when I look at the data, as you move through a healthcare system, I can find out if there's differential access to cardiac care, to obstetric care, to any number of things, because I can compare two groups, the settlers and the non-Indigenous people. And our colleagues in New Zealand did just that. They found differential treatment. Kids not getting the puffer that they need for their asthma, but Pakia or white kids getting it. So that racism is embedded very deeply in all the processes that we do. Brian Sinclair. Does everybody know about Brian Sinclair? Put your hand up if you do. Down. And who doesn't know about Brian Sinclair? The students, okay. Brian Sinclair was a young man who was paraplegic, so he couldn't have a great sensation for his bowels and his bladder because of a spinal injury that he'd sustained earlier in his life. And he went to, in 2008, he went to his doctor not far from the Health Science Center, where if you're going to be a medical student, you will train in the same room that killed him. I'm just going to tell you that. So he went there, he went to his doctor because he had a little bit of pain, kind of around his bladder area, and the color of his urine coming out of the catheter bag had changed. And Brian would have known that he had a UTI or a bladder infection. So he knew he needed some medicine. So he went to the doctor, and the doctor and the nurse said, we can't change the catheter at this clinic. We'll send you with a note to the Health Science Center. So you need a bladder change and antibiotics and probably some fluids and monitoring for enough time to make sure that the infection hadn't gone anywhere. They found him over 30 hours later dead in the same emergency room. And an inquest was held, and we examined the inquest. There are a number of us who examined it. And what we discovered was that Brian Sinclair died of racism, Indigenous specific racism. Full stop. Full stop. I'll take any judge on, I'll take any legal expert in Canada, anywhere, I'll take you on with this case. Okay, he died of racism that was directed at the Indigenous body. And the consequences to that is Brian is no longer with us today. In fact, Brian died alone in septic shock, which would have been a very painful death, because he was vomiting, he was seen to be vomiting, etc. like that. And he died alone with over 100 people having been seen during the 34 hours that he was there. And the inquest suggested that Brian was partly responsible for his own death. There's no evidence of that at all, okay? But what's more confusing and what's more impenetrable in Canadian society is the lack of concern by settler society about the Brian Sinclairs and just leaving it. And it's just another Indian day. And that's the expertise of Shireen Razik when she was at Indigenous deaths in custody. Because you have to imagine that medicine is like being in custody. If you're really sick, I can actually take your rights away and hold you there. It's just like justice systems can. So it's kind of in custody. But there are consequences to that. So there's a few words I'm going to talk about, and white supremacy is one. I said settler supremacy, only because white supremacy, as you know, is this idea that white skin for everything is superior to other people. And its creation has gone on for a long time. And I think the 14 or 1500s, when the Catholic Church was intimate to the ruling of Europe, they practiced, the settlers before they came to our lands, they practiced the killing arts on Muslims and Jews, preferentially on those lands. And then once the Renaissance came, then they practiced the killing arts on their own people. And by the time they came to settler to Canada or to North America or to Turtle Island, they brought with them dogs who were vicious dogs, who had been trained to eat only human meat, so that those dogs, you could stick them on an Indian and they'll tear the Indian apart. And in one caption in this book by Stannard is a woman, and she has a noose around her neck. It's a drawing. And she looks dead, and then she has a noose around her right leg. And at the bottom of that noose is a baby. And then there's a priest, like doing last rites or whatever. And the caption reads, this I believe was in Brazil, that the woman knew, this indigenous woman knew that the dogs that were vicious, they just tear you apart live, were coming. So her thing was to try and kill her baby and herself before she could feel the violence of those dogs killing them. But the baby didn't die. So what did the priest do? You think a priest, is about goodness, is about whatever. He blessed the baby, pulled the dogs away, blessed the baby, so that after the dogs tear apart that little baby, that baby would go to heaven. And this is true, okay? So this is the origin of the things we're talking about. I can't read it.
That's 10 minutes.
10 minutes, thanks. I got my new glasses, I got ripped off. Okay, so you have to understand that origin, because people, again, there are 3 points for the students. Number one, that racism against Indigenous people is real. Racism has its origins from the beginning of the relationship of settlers coming onto these lands. One Brazilian, or no, you'd say Portuguese, man wanted an Indigenous woman, and she didn't want to have intimacy. And so he whipped her. He physically whipped her into submission. And after he raped her, he told the scriber that he'd never had a better night than with a prostitute in Barcelona or wherever. You know what I mean? So that even the sexualized violence against Indigenous women has as its origin hundreds of years ago, and is going through the system continuously with our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It has its origin. And why do I emphasize that? Is because I don't want you, and I'm speaking to the young people, I don't want you to go forward in your journey thinking that there's something you carry that you can't explain, that you have to feel accountable for, and you have to feel shame for. You don't have to feel shame for anything coming to this institution, okay? You only have to be proud that you're here, okay? But understand that the things you're going to hear, the things that you're going to feel in your belly, when people say things to you, their origin comes from differently. It's not about us. We happen to be the object of that racism, okay? Necessarily because our ancestors have been here for tens of thousands of years, basically, okay? And that positionality is really much what Albert Memmi says in Colonized or Colonized about the relationship between a colonized and colonized person and the psychology. So if you get a chance, find those little books and read them and study them, because from there you can actually predict behaviors of people. One of the things that Razik says and other scholars is that in order to fulfill the settler fantasy about Indigenous, about Canada or settler Canada, we must be made to be subhuman, so not really human. Okay, so that we are perpetually in a frontier environment, that around the body of an Indigenous person or a collective Indigenous people is the frontier. And in the frontier, law is not upheld, there's no medicine, there's no justice, there's no righteousness, there's nothing except killing. Okay, and this is really important to understand, because the use of the English language around, like Razik talks about it, is killing an Indian or murdering an Indian. There's a very big difference, because you can kill a moose, you can kill a rabbit, you can kill something. But if you kill an Indian, you're saying that Indian is not human. If you murder an Indian, then you're actually saying that Indian person is human. Okay, so things can happen to us. and be said about us in this institution, because in many ways we're not considered human. And so some of my lectures that I'll do, predominantly white people, I'll say, my name is Barry Valley, I come from the community so-and-so, and I just want to tell you I'm human. And people just get really freaked out about that. I'll say, no, 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 say it with me, Indians are humans. And if they're truly humans, then actually you're going to treat them appropriately, and they will receive equal resources in an institution like this, equal opportunities, true opportunities. And I wrote here that the academy is the weaponized tool necessary to exact the intention of Indigenous-specific racism in colonial Canada. So this institution will always reproduce itself with the status of white men being at the pinnacle of this institution. It will always find ways to reproduce itself, you know, in many subtle ways that are so hard that you could spend probably 1,000 PhDs trying to unravel that. So two things that are really hard to understand or see: the killing of the Indian and the ongoing creation of settler identity on stolen lands. This is how it works. Just a few minutes to talk about what white as race. So sometimes when you talk to non-Indigenous people, you can ask them, where do you come from? They say, I don't know. I think my mom came from England, my dad came from Germany. No, no, no. I'll say, identify yourself. Tell me what your race is. What is your background? What is your origin? Who are your people? I don't know. We came to Canada about 100 years ago. Not good enough. Not good enough. Not that you have to be identify as a white person or as a settler, but we as Indigenous people are continually racialized in many open and not so open ways, so that we're seen as a race that's kind of subhuman. But we actually, in order to understand that relationship, the binary, and Linda, my colleague here, doesn't like me using this particular term, probably because she's a PhD and I'm not, or me one, that in this society there's the settler and then there's the Indigenous person. It's a very simple binary. It doesn't explain all of the phenomena that occurs. But you have to identify the settler in order to understand why oppression occurs for Indigenous peoples and why it's necessary. And that's what white power is about. That's what white supremacy is about. And you have to have very specific ways to unravel that. Just a few minutes, we're going to talk about actions of the Academy. How many, 5 minutes? 4 minutes?
For question, it's 12:34, 12:45 we finish, so 10 minutes.
Okay, no, I'll get that.
One question.
Okay, thanks. So actions of the Academy: sweeping policies and practice to address Indigenous-specific racism / elimination of white supremacy in this institution. You'll have to have actions and policies that bring that out, contend with it, deal with it courageously at this university. And that starts from the president all the way to whoever else is, you know, lowest on the power gradient of this university. So we need graduated consequences when Indigenous specific racism appears, when people are impacted by that. And we need termination of attendance or employment as the final outcome. If you perpetually demonstrate or inflict violence on Indigenous people in this institution who are Indigenous, and it's recognized, you should be fired. Full stop. That's it. There's no holding hands. There's no singing kumbaya on this action. This action of racism has terminal force in our communities, and we are dying every day because of racism that appears as normalized. We're dying every day, and I can say that because I'm one of the most senior Indigenous medical scholars in this country today, and we have that evidence, okay? So for those who are not Indigenous, your termination, should you demonstrate racism, Doesn't seem like a lot. You will live. We need proper investment in Indigenous knowledges, practices, and protocols, and that they become normalized, not essentialized. So remember that just because I'm brown, he's brown, 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 we're actually very different people. We might share common things, brown over there, whatever. Okay, we're not essentialized. You can't essentialize us. Some of us do pray, some of us don't pray. Some of us have practices, some of us don't have practices. Okay, some of us speak the language, some of us don't speak the language. But these are consequences of colonization, mostly around the language. I suggest that, I'll give it 6 months, that the current president of the University of Manitoba be removed from his seat nicely, and we put in an Indigenous female in that position. Full stop. We have many Indigenous leaders who are female in our community who are excellent leaders that can take this university to the levels it's never been reached in over 100 years. And we need the governing forces at this university to be composed of 70% Indigenous people in order to account for the inequities that are maintained and the inequities that stem from historical violence and trauma. We need that, and we need to control the system. This university, and this is the big one for me because I'm an educator, that Indigenous people who have been impacted by racialized violence from a historical context or from the current context be given their first degree tuition free. And that this institution adopt that practice for 100 years henceforth. That our Indigenous kids, who are the products of not only their own indigeneity, but the violence against Indigenous people, be attended to correctly so that they can get the first degree. Because we know that if you get 1 degree, and this is for the students again, when you get 1 degree, if you don't go into medicine, you don't go into engineering or law, whatever, I mean, it'd be okay if you do, but 1 degree you get. We know that your ability to gain access to a job differs if you didn't have that degree. And by doing that, then should you choose to have kids one day, your kids will be healthier. Your brothers and sisters will be healthier. Your grandma and grandpa will be healthier because you came here. And that's a real paradox to think about, right? Yeah. But this is what it is. To get that 1 degree. If you want to go forward further, that we want mandatory entrance examination for all people who wish to come to the University of Manitoba to assess their knowledge and skills regarding Indigenous peoples and their current journey. And really what I'm saying is that we have a way to examine people coming to the University of Manitoba, all people, to assist people who have implicit Indigenous specific racial bias embedded within their personality from what is Southern Canada, and that be attended to from the beginning. Because if you do that, then the work that Linda and I do at the University of Manitoba, at the School of Medicine, will be lessened, because if people coming into medical school will actually have some sense about themselves and be able to attend to greater depths of courage and practice in medicine. And that's it, thank you.
We have some time for questions, and I'm going to let you field the hand. And Facebook Live questions as well if they come.
There's none, yeah.
So how do I help my little sister, who is Black and Indigenous, and going into the healthcare field? How can I give her support through what she is facing, trying to become a pharmacist?
One of the biggest things for our students is that you have to believe her. You must believe her. Some of the things that happen to students who are racialized or people of color and mixed people like Indigenous and Black, for example, there are horrendous things that go on, horrendous little bits and pieces of racial microaggressions that happen on a daily basis. And we have that experience at our School of Medicine with a number of our students coming forward and complaining about the racism that occurs. And the biggest thing is for us to believe them. And the other thing is for us to advocate when we get permission for that. And that is a really tricky part, again, for the young people who are here. It is a tricky part. Because this university, I would say, and I'd like anybody here who's from this university to correct me. When you complain about racism, there is no pathway for your liberation in there. So when you complain about racism and you experience racism, you're doing it alone. Because I'm going to tell you right now, and if the president is here, he could tell me in a different way, or any of the other people here, we have no pathway to support Indigenous and racialized people when they experience the violence of racism. Now, if there's anybody here who could counter that, I'd be so happy. So when our family members enter this institution and they talk about their experiences, believe them and never interrogate and be there. Because sometimes just having a family of Indigenous people that you can actually go to and just talk about this stuff gives a little bit of relief, a little bit of a sense of liberation that you can actually go on and go back into that class. And you know what, after 30 years of being here at this, I've been teaching people for 30 years from across the world as well. I don't have an answer to that excellent question, and that makes me really sad. Anybody else?
How can we make a pathway for people to report this racism?
This up here is protest, protest, protest. We're too shy, not shy, we want to be friends and things like that, but you know what? When you guys, before I retire, have a protest, and I'm coming down there, man, I'm hanging out with you. Protest. Because sometimes, it appears that, being what's called dialogical, communicating, and pretty articulate, more so than a lot of English speakers, on mine, it's not enough. You have to protest and you have to demand. Because this university would not exist without you. It can't exist without you. It's impossible to exist without you. This is a learner institution. And so you have to make this institution accountable, generation, and move it forward, and don't be afraid.
And if I can add to that, I think that students who experience anti-Indigenous racism at the institution first go to an Indigenous person that they know and have a conversation. And that happens all the time with me, with other Indigenous staff here. And then there are formal mechanisms, even though they say it can be informal, they're formal, but it doesn't work for us, right? So trying to indigenize that, and I hate that terminology, but trying to do it in a way that people feel comfortable in going forward. I can't honestly tell you, and I've gone through this process at many institutions where challenging racism in the academy through the formal structures, it is violent. So for me to sit here and tell you, no, you can go to this office and this will work out well for you, I can't tell you that. And the Vice Provost Indigenous engagement here. So I think that we feel that. We feel a lot of the racism that our students experience. And we come together. We've had circles about this. So there's not something formal. So when you ask that question, I'm part of senior admin. I have to say, no, we don't. But other people will say, yes, we have these mechanisms, but they're not working for us.
Other questions? Yep, back there.
How do you feel?
Pardon me?
How do you feel?
About what? Pardon me? The thing that hinges me, because I want to think about retiring. The thing that hinges me in meetings like this is you and the students, and that's why I'm so happy they're here. Because that, for me, the questions that you ask actually tell me that you're thinking. What I, as a senior Indigenous person at this university, I want you to think critically. I want you to ask questions about your own indigeneity in the context of a colonial environment that is the University of Manitoba. I want you to ask questions when the questions need to be asked. And I want you to challenge the status quo of racial microaggressions that occur on a day-to-day basis in all the rooms that exist in this institution. And I want you to stand up, if you can. Stand up. Just physically stand up and ask a question. By doing so, you'll unravel something where people will reflect, did I really mean that? You know? And that's the way it is. And how do I feel? I feel, I actually don't know how to feel. I feel energized in a way, but I feel continuously angry for sure about the racism that exists.
I saw one other hand, and I'd like to take that. I recognize that we're out of time, but if we could take that question, and then if people feel the need, if you have an appointment, feel free to duck out, but we'll take this question over this next one.
When Brian Sinclair died, they said that he has his own, like they tried to blame himself for it or something, right?
Yes.
But if he didn't care about himself, why would he be there?
Totally. So the question is, if Brian Sinclair, hinted at by some of the legal people as medical people in the inquest, suggested that because he sniffed, for example, that there were changes in his tissue in the brain, and that somehow translates to him not wanting to get help, which is completely utter garbage. Because in fact, our colleague over here suggests that when you look at the video, you'll see Brian actually ask for help many times, really. He's looking for help. So his cognition was normal, it was fine. But the system has to impose stereotypes in order to match what they believe about us. And that's really the difficult part, is to unravel that, and to do that in public, against a whole system of judges and scholarly medical people. And this is where the exhaustion comes from. But that's a great question.
Okay, I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I see people aren't rushing to get out, so I know that sometimes people like to ask questions. I don't think we have to get out of the room right away, so feel free to come out.